if you want to save taxes, what's the most important thing?
Taxes?
Yeah, if you say, I don't want to pay taxes anymore. And I come to you, the tax lawyer extraordinaire, and say, I don't want to pay taxes anymore. What do I do?
First, you earn $1 billion,
There you go. That's where I was going.
and you hire a tax lawyer
Okay.
who let
Okay. Well, let's just go ahead and get started. So I will start now. Welcome to Corporate Law Lab. I'm Neil Taylor, Director of the Corporate Law Center at the University of Cincinnati, and today we are joined by Jordan Bleznick. Jordan worked for many years with the noted investor Carl Icahn, and we will talk about Icahn through the lens of tax over the next however many episodes this turns out to be. So welcome, Jordan.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil.
So you grew up in Cincinnati, that's right?
Yeah, you officially grow up in Cincinnati if you go to high school there. And
Exactly.
I went to what I perceived to be one of the better high schools, which was Walnut Hills.
So you
So
do know what the first question to any Cincinnatian is, where did you
where
go?
you went to high school, you could have gone, if you went to Yale, which I didn't, that wasn't as important.
And your father was a UC professor in Spanish literature, right?
Correct. His specialty was the 16th century El Don Quixote. And he taught at UC for over 30 years.
You were telling me before about when your father had a semester, I think it was,
A
in
sabbatical.
a sabbatical, okay,
Yeah,
in Spain in the early 60s.
correct. I was in third grade at the time. I left third grade in the middle of the year and went with my sister and parents to Madrid. And one day I came home and my mother said, "What did you learn in school today?" And I started doing the catechism. Next day I was in a different school. So that's my Spanish sabbatical story.
But did you maintain your fluency in Spanish after you left?
Well, I learned some Spanish then. I took a lot of Spanish in high school and college.
Yeah.
I've been to Spain several times. I don't call myself fluent, but I'm proficient.
Why did you decide to go to get? You got an LLM at NYU in
Correct.
taxation, correct?
Right.
And
19, just to, I don't, I'll admit how ancient I am. 1980, I got my LLM in tax at NYU.
well, just to show how ancient I am, I was almost out of high school by then, so it's not like
Right. You're on the accelerated program.
yeah, yeah, I was five, but in high school. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, I really had NYU in tax has always been well known, but it wasn't that popular, especially, in Ohio back then. And I didn't really even think about what kind of law I wanted to practice, but I was always a good problem solver, a good numbers guy. And I talked to one of my dad's friends, a guy named Richard Schwartz, and he said, "Jordan, go to this program. It's a 1-year program. When you come back, I'll hire you and you'll work for me." Schwartz, that was the Schwartz firm I was talking about.
Right.
So I go to the program. I do pretty well, or, well enough. And then a firm in Columbus, Ohio, which was about a 30 lawyer firm, those were how big the firms were in those days, offered me a job at a much higher salary. So I had to tell Richard I couldn't come.
Then how did you find your way back from Columbus to New York? Because you spent the bulk of your professional career in New York, right?
Correct. I spent like 90% of my professional career in New York. The real truth to the matter is I worked in Columbus. I always liked New York. And my girlfriend at the time, who became my wife, and then my divorced wife, was from New York. And we got engaged in Columbus. I said, "I'll live in New York," because I always had wanted to go to New York. It gave me the excuse. So pretty much I moved to New York in the early 80s, and I started working at a middle-sized firm. In those days, 30, 40 lawyers you could be a quote-unquote full-service law firm at 30 or 40 lawyers or 50 lawyers. And I started working for them in 1984.
And then shortly after you joined, you met Carl Icahn.
Correct. In 1984, Carl did his first big deal, which we may talk about later, the American Car and Foundry ACF railcar deal. I did not work on that deal, but we started working right after that deal. So pretty much right after that deal, up until 2023, I had, working on Carl's stuff. Not in the law firm, not necessarily exclusively, but he was the main client.
And so how did you meet him and how did you start to, because I think you have told me that for most of the time after the first few years, he was your main client until you left and went in-house with him, right?
Right. Well, I was a relatively junior associate who eventually evolved into a junior partner. After a period of years, when it became evident that even though I wasn't talking to Carl all the time, I kept working on more and more Carl stuff, more and more Icahn stuff. Finally, I started talking to him. And so the relationship went pretty well between me and Carl, to the point where he decided that he wanted to have a general counsel and a couple other counsel, and I call myself a general tax counsel. So in 2001, he actually, which is unusual, I wasn't, he views his employees as distressed assets. And I was one of the few people he ever hired that was actually working a legitimate job. He came, in other words, he pursued me.
Right. He wasn't somebody that...
I mean, pursuing by Carl isn't exactly a bunch of chocolates and roses. Then early in the following year, which is '02, he called me in, and he had a couple of his senior guys there, and they asked me to work for him. And I thought about it. I thought, ultimately it was a great thing to do, because I'm not the kind of guy, I view myself as a guy that's somewhat good at problem solving, somewhat good at structuring deals. I could maybe get clients, but it would have taken some time for me to develop. So I didn't have to worry. I would have one client, Carl and all his companies. So it struck me as a pretty good idea. He says, you're in charge of all tax items, anything with the word tax on it. So one thing was I had been a junior partner in a law firm and didn't have my own client base, which wasn't atypical when you were a junior partner. I said, after being in a law partnership and practicing law, I don't want to report to anybody. He says, what about me? I said, I'll report to you. Okay, but I don't want to report to the CFO or the general counsel or the CEO. I thought that was a very important thing. He agreed with me. He says, no, you talk to me. Because he looked at it as his money. And so he wanted someone to keep track of it.
Carl is extremely well known. One of the first people that would have been described in the press as a corporate raider.
Exactly.
And I think he describes himself as an activist investor.
Yeah.
How is there a difference, or is just one a nicer name for the other?
Well, there's a little bit of a difference. And by the way, if any of people want to type in the word corporate raider, I did that this morning, into Google, you usually see a picture of Carl.
How would you describe his approach?
Yeah. Well, let's answer the first question. Okay. The first question is, to me, and I think to anybody, when Carl first started out, he would go out and buy positions in companies that he studied by looking at 10Ks and talking to people, no real inside information. One of his first companies was Tappan in Mansfield, Ohio. He would go out to a company, he would then, he'd buy shares, he'd accumulate some stock, he'd then call up the company and said, by the way, I'm your shareholder, and, unless you do X, Y, and Z. He would tell them what he thought was wrong with the company. He was looking for undervalued companies. He would tell them flat out what was wrong with their company. He would maybe start a proxy fight where he would try to get on the board of directors. In the early days of Carl, the deals were smaller. They just bought him out. That's what a raider really is. A raider goes in and fights and stuff, and he's bought out, doesn't help the other shareholders. Now he morphed into a activist, and I won't say this was intentional, but they changed some of the rules. In the 1980s, they started enacting, enacted a very little-known green mail excise tax, which in effect said you couldn't go into a company and have yourself bought out on terms better than the other shareholders. But as far as his tactics, they weren't that much different.
Okay. Yeah, I saw something where they asked him about management, and he said, well, they're all scratch golfers.
Well, there's scratch golfers, then there's me.
Okay.
And it goes into the quick story of I try to play golf various times, and I'm scratch, but I'm not a golfer. And he would call me and say, Bleznick, why are you playing golf? Are you any good? I said, not really. He says, so why are you wasting your time? But if I said I was good, he would have said, you're spending too much time playing golf. He did like tennis. Tennis was okay.
Well, tennis didn't take 4 hours to play. Was Carl fun to work with?
90% of the time, he was very entertaining. And I told him, I said, I think you're the funniest billionaire. But sometimes he didn't like something you did, and he'd be on your case for relentless for a while. And that was not fun. But I would say 90% of the time, working on deals and all that stuff. And it was a very real place. It was a very flat organization.
Were there any other conditions you set on what's required to get you in-house?
Right. One of the conditions was, so my sons were young. I said, Carl, every Wednesday I take my kids, and other days, Wednesday, Friday, I take my sons out to dinner. I have to leave a little early. And he agreed to that. It was better telling him up front rather than taking the pain later.
And then Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes showed up on a Wednesday?
Well, no, Friday. It was Wednesday and sometimes Friday.
Okay.
So yeah, we were told Leslie Stahl did a piece called The Icon Lift. And it was 7:30, it was 8 o'clock. I finally said, my kids are calling me every 2 minutes. I finally said, I'm going to leave. It's 8 o'clock. I went home, took my kids to dinner. A few months later, they show Leslie and Carl walking down the hall of the main, floor, and then there's a dark office. And Carl said, and Leslie was saying over and over how late everybody worked. Carl's like, well, he didn't work very late. We're going to have to get to the bottom of this. And somehow he didn't remember it was my office, or he didn't say it. But, a lot of people noticed. They called me and said, Bleznick, that had to be you.
No one else had the guts to leave
No
early.
one had the guts. Some people could say stupidity, but guts is good.
So what were you, examining public information, looking at public filings, what were you and Carl seeing that other people were missing?
Well, the simple one is what I'm seeing. Very rarely was there a guy like me, and I had a couple other people that worked with me on this. Did people look at the tax assets? Sometimes they did, but a lot of times they didn't. And for accounting purposes, there's something where, let's say you had a big net operating loss. if the company wasn't expected to use that loss because it was losing money, they would write that loss off. It was called a valuation allowance, and they would say the losses were zero. So anybody looking at it without any kind of tax overlay is going to say, well, this loss ain't worth very much. I mean, Carl, he just put together, the company. In other words, he'd look at a target, they might have a lawsuit against them, the judgment in one case, they might be a conglomerate, and he's saying, well, if one company like, eBay spins off PayPal, it's a no-brainer that they should. Some of these ideas, he didn't necessarily be the first person, but he was the first person they took seriously. So it was a combination, but, then eventually he'd file, he'd start writing letters, and he'd talk to the company and that type of stuff. Most of the time, in a hostile situation, we ended up with at least 2 directors, but that wasn't a controlling interest.
And the only way you could do that is by having things that, acquiring losses only works for you if you've got profits to offset it.
Oh yeah, but the key to the whole thing is that a loss, one of my big things, and private equity guys don't really even do this, although they maybe a little, that our holding company would acquire controlling interests. One company may be a profitable company, one company may be a loss company. The key was to be able to use the losses of the loss company against profits of the profit company. That was a large part.
And that even included buying companies out of bankruptcy.
Exactly. There were bankruptcy rules, which, some people know about. It's not like we invented it. But there are some bankruptcy rules, usually for tax purposes, your net operating loss. In bankruptcy, most companies have a loss in their plant or in their operations. Usually, they would have a loss. So Carl would go to great lengths with my urging to say we got to acquire at least 80% of the company, because the 80% threshold was a threshold for tax consolidation. Bankruptcy, coming back to bankruptcy, had some special rules, and they still have them because people probably don't pay attention to them anymore, where if you buy debt, a lot of times in a bankruptcy, the equity's wiped out. Then you have your bonds, which are usually unsecured. And then you have your secured debt, which is usually what they call the fulcrum security, which means that a lot of times your more senior debt in a bankruptcy will become the equity. But most of the banks that were lenders could care less about NOLs. But we did. So we would buy the debt, and we would be the ones that would acquire the company rather than the banks. They couldn't have a company, they didn't want like a casino on their books, or they didn't want a telecom company or whatever kind of company on their books. They wanted to just get as much money as possible.
So when you're looking at a bankruptcy filing and the financial statements that have to be produced when they go into bankruptcy, you're seeing deferred tax assets that they're hardly even there. I mean, they're valued at zero, right?
Right. Well, that's the whole thing, because a company that's doing poorly for accounting, for the financial statements, you have to make a projection whether you can use your net operating losses.
So, and a lot of times you would run into companies where the operating company itself, the business wasn't necessarily a bad business. It had just been over leveraged.
Yeah, or exactly.
I guess the stratosphere would maybe be the best example of that.
Over leveraged companies were companies that had judgments against them. Pretty much the only way they could get out of it, they could have a business that was throwing off profits, but they couldn't pay off the debt. And
Right. So
so
they
it's,
had, I guess, to put it, go back to an earlier thing you said, they had cash flow.
they had cash flow, but they really didn't, because if they had cash flow, it went to the debt.
Right. They had money
Yeah,
coming in the door, but
yeah,
every dime that came in
yes,
had to go back out, and so
right,
they weren't profitable, and they were
right.
in a death spiral.
They wouldn't. So they needed to restructure the debt. So usually the senior, depending on the tranche, but usually the senior debt, maybe one tranche below, would actually become the equity holder. And most people didn't want to hold the equity, these banks.
So the Stratosphere is a
Yeah.
casino in the north end of the strip in 1996, which was when it opened. It had a $245 million operating loss, which drove it almost straight into bankruptcy. Carl, Carl and you purchased it enough debt to take control of the company.
Uh, Bought the debt of the Stratosphere, and ultimately that became the equity of the Stratosphere. So we ended up owning the Stratosphere, which was and maybe still is the tallest structure west of Chicago. But that's a good example. We did a lot of debt plays, and most of those were bankruptcies.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, I think it was 100 million that was invested around there.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
Then they invested more because they built another tower or something. Yeah.
and then sold it after 10 years for 1.3 billion.
Right. Well, there's a couple small casinos thrown in, Arizona Charlie's and one or two other
Okay.
casinos. But we paid about 300 million for everything. And we sold it to Goldman Sachs in '07, '08 for about $1.3 billion. That was a good one. Deferred the gain on it by doing what they call a like-kind exchange.
So explain what a like-kind exchange is.
A like-kind exchange is when you have real property and you exchange it for real property owned by somebody else. So you're not cashing out. You're just exchanging one piece of real property for another.
So on the day you do the deal, do you have to be that afternoon, okay, thank you very much. I've got my 1.3 billion. Now I'm going to spend it all on this other real estate.
You have to designate it
Okay.
within 60 days, 30 days. So we went on this wild mission of $1.3 billion is a lot of real estate, especially back in the 90s. We looked at some class properties like the Park Lane Hotel. I don't know if you know that one. We looked at the Diplomat down in Florida, but that was owned by Union, so that was a problem. So we ended up, and usually when you do a like-kind exchange, you're not doing it because you love the property. You're doing it because it has a lease on it with a big tenant. And so we ended up buying AT&T buildings, like the headquarters, and they were subject to a 25-year lease. So it's like almost like an annuity, a deferral. He very rarely put a lot of money in the companies, but sometimes he did. And Estradi put some money in to build a second tower. I mean, if there's certain things in motion that made sense, he would put the money up.
And then, so that was 2007. And then the next year, you're back in another casino deal with Tropicana, right?
We did a lot of casino deals.
Okay.
Some I didn't even mention. Sands down in Atlantic City, Lumiere in St. Louis. There was a lot of casino. I worked on a lot of casino deals. Carl liked casinos.
And Tropicana was in bankruptcy too, right?
Tropicana was in bankruptcy. The Taj was in bankruptcy. Tropicana was an interesting situation. They were, we were buying the debt of Tropicana, and they owned a lot of casinos. We were only interested in the New Jersey casino down in Atlantic City. They had other ones, including one in Las Vegas. And it went into bankruptcy, and they were working on a plan, and they got the plan approved. And I looked at it, I said, you know what? The Tropicana is being sold for 200 million, but it has tax basis of 700 million. If somehow, instead of buying the Tropicana and getting a 200 million basis, we could do what they call a tax-free deal, then we would get 700 a basis. Now that's a great example of if I went to a CFO or a GC, they would not be happy. Because we had to go back to the gaming, but I said to Carl, this 500 million delta, if you ever sell the Tropicana or, if you ever have profits, at the tax rate at that time, it was worth, a few hundred million.
The tax basis and the book value then, what does the company look like on day one when you bring it out of bankruptcy after doing that?
It depends. For book purposes, the 700 million in tax basis I found in the 10K. The book basis was lower because for book purposes, accounting, you can write down goodwill and stuff. But for tax, when you don't write down for tax like you do for book. So even on day one, when you start a company day one, you put 100 million into it, book and tax are the same.
Right.
But over a period of years, book and tax become, there's correlations, but they're not the same. So it could have shown a book value, I don't know exactly what it was, of 200 million, and a tax value of 700 million. But like every other bankruptcy, that NOL would not show up as an asset because nobody thought they could use it.
And at this point, we're now in 2008. There's plenty of profits about that.
Oh yeah,
that you can offset.
Well, to show you how good it was, or seemed good, we took that extra 500 as direct offset when we resold it. We resold it for $1 billion and whatever. So
1.85, if you want to know the exact number.
185 sounds about right.
Right.
But I took great pride in that because it would not have happened, if there wasn't an in-house tax lawyer. Maybe it would, but much less likely. Because you needed a guy behind it to in effect, advocate for it. Ultimately, it went to Carl. People tried to intervene. And we ended up writing a different bankruptcy plan. But we stayed within the same structure, but we wrote it so it was a different kind of transaction. And that was probably a premier example of me changing something.
Yeah, there was one more casino that if we didn't talk about Carl and casinos and you, we'd be leaving it out. The Taj Mahal.
Yeah, that one was sick though. That was not gonna. I could see that one coming down the pike. That baby was not going to be a profit at the end of the day.
Because it was so over-levered.
Well, they had big union problems. It was over-leveraged. But for tax purposes, I said, this is not a tax deal. He acquired the whole casino. It wasn't like he just did it for tax. It wasn't like he tried to lose money.
Right.
And for tax purposes, I said, Carl, you have to keep this thing going, to show the business purpose and the economic substance. So he says, I'll keep it through the summer.
And so that's not one where you turned it around. You ended up selling it.
No, we sold it to
the Hard Rock Casino.
Yeah. They sold it to them, I'm going to say for like 50 million. We sold the Taj Mahal. I don't even know what the Taj Mahal. They renamed it. I think it still exists as another casino, but honestly, I don't even know.
So enough of casinos. Let's switch to a different topic entirely. I wanted to talk to you about Texaco and the Texaco two-step. Texaco, large oil company, and when was it? In the late 80s that it ended up in bankruptcy?
Yes.
So how did that happen?
So Texaco actually was a profitable company. They weren't highly leveraged like some other companies, but they were sued by Pennzoil, another oil company, for $11 billion. At the lower court, they got sued for $11 billion and quote unquote they lost. And I mean, they could have kept going up the courts. But by going into bankruptcy, they could stay it to some extent and gave him time to negotiate it. But if you look at 11 billion, that would put Texaco in insolvency. But it was really a contingent claim because, it wasn't at the highest level of courts. And you'd think it would be settled out at a lower number, which is what ultimately happened. Carl went in and he bought, I don't know, 10, 12% of Texaco. I forget the exact number. And he inserted him into the negotiations.
So this got to be one of the few times in your 40 years of working with Carl where you were buying equity in a bankruptcy.
Yeah, normally equity in a bankruptcy, with one exception that I could talk about, normally equity is not what you want to be buying in a bankruptcy. Because if you have a lot of liability, if a contingent claim, you're going to say, what is that contingent claim for 11 billion really going to be settled for? Nobody thought it'd be settled for 11.
Right.
And ultimately it was settled for 3, which is a big delta. 3 to 11, that 8 billion. So Carl went in and he was instrumental in negotiating. You had the Pennzoil guys and the Texaco guys, and you had Carl, and everybody was trying to negotiate and get, go down in the number, but not exactly, saying what the number was. Ultimately, it was about 3 billion. Then part of the Texaco deal that Carl got, which was not really a bankruptcy thing, was one of his big things historically is if you have a lot of cash, give it back to the shareholders. And that's been one of his mantras for many, many years. I think other guys do, it's a known thing now. In those days, maybe not as popular. So Texaco had some cash. They also, I think, sold 1 or 2 divisions. And he got them, Texaco, to give a special dividend. The special dividend, the stock was selling for $50, the special dividend was about $8. I'm sitting at a table, I'm at that point, a senior level associate. And Al Kingsley, who was Carl's right-hand man at the time in terms of investments, says, Bleznick, we're going to take a special dividend of $8 a share. And then I thought about it for a minute, maybe 2. I said, they just changed the tax law a couple months ago, where if you take out a dividend more than 10% of the value of your shares, then you will have unfavorable tax treatment on receiving that dividend and getting a deduction for the dividend. So they want to do $8. I said, $8 ain't going to work. But you could do $4. It didn't seem that big of an idea. You could do $4 and then wait another 90 days and do $4 or 91 days, so that each dividend was under 10%.
And it was such that you could announce both, that you were...
You announced both at the same, you declared them, The funny thing is I never saw hardly anybody or nobody doing it. It's not rocket science, but, you got to know the rules there were rules there, and you had to be careful about them.
At that point, Carl had been waging a proxy fight and trying to get more control of the company. And at some point, I guess maybe as part of the dividend thing, he entered into a standstill agreement.
Exactly.
So what's a standstill agreement?
That you won't go out and buy, you'll just preserve your position, not go out and increase it.
So he had essentially at that point given up.
He's accomplished his mission.
Right.
So he has no reason to increase his share. The special dividend helped him not because he took it with his shares, but he could sell his shares. There was a great demand for these shares. And he sold all his shares because they wanted to take advantage of this tax treatment. There's a tremendous demand for this. So he sold the shares the price went up, was held up because of the tax treatment of it.
And because people knew there was a dividend coming.
Yes, it was announced. And so we sold him into what was a strong market. And his gain on that, I think, was about 800. And yeah, his gain was about 800 million.
In 1989, that was
And yeah, in today's dollars, it'd be 2 billion, something like that.
Right. So that had to be a key to what when you were coming up with structures, they not only had to work mathematically, but you also had to have a good argument that they had economic substance.
Yes. And that was a good thing, because working with Carl, like, it's possible that Carl wouldn't have done certain of these deals without the taxes, but he bought whole businesses. It's kind of hard to argue that that's a tax play when you buy like a whole casino and say,
keep it for 10 years.
And you keep it. It's kind of hard to argue that that's a tax play. It's not a very good case for the government. Now, if we shut things down immediately, that's a very good case for the government.
TWA, for our students who've never heard of TWA, was at one point one of the largest airlines in the world.
And a big international airline.
Right.
TWA, the airlines were going through a tough time. I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but they had done deregulation and this and that. And so TWA, but Carl had an interest in TWA. So he acquired a small, just like he always did, a relatively small position in TWA, made an offer. It took a couple of years to buy the whole company. Now, in order to buy the whole company, you would have to put debt on the company. So TWA, they weren't doing that well, but they had some valuable assets. They had these routes to London were considered very valuable. And he also had a fairly good air fleet. But he took over the airline, he sold the valuable routes, he did a sale leaseback of a large number of airplanes. So he really did take out a bunch of assets, or, sold a bunch of assets. I wrote the original structure memo on acquiring TWA. And in that memo, it wasn't like I just wrote it without help. Other people said that we're going to form a holding company which acquires 80% of TWA, more than 80%. Why? Because we could tax consolidate. So when they were heading toward their first bankruptcy, I think they had 3 bankruptcies, it was brought up that because the holding company owned 80% of TWA, and obviously Icon owned the holding company, that there was an underfunded pension plan that technically could have been $1 billion. And Carl, and they put, if an 80% company bought TWA, which in this case happened, every company that Carl owned 80% or more of, even if they're completely unrelated to TWA, would be jointly liable for the underfunding of the pension plan. Nobody raised their hand and said they were the ERISA lawyer on that deal. It's one of the few times I really haven't seen something like this happen. I mean, maybe it did, but it's textbook in ERISA. So, he became liable. It was not a good moment. He became liable for the entire pension plan. And so in the bankruptcy, he negotiated the liability down, but he lost control of the company. He negotiated the liability down to, he lent them some money, and then he agreed to contribute to the PBGC, the pension corporation, $30 million for 8 years. So if it came out of his pocket. TWA didn't have the resources to pay it.
So $240 million over 8
Yeah.
years he contributed to the pension plan.
Correct. The good news is we use it as an ordinary business deduction.
There you go. There's always
So,
a silver lining when the tax guy's around.
Right. And he also lent them some money. And he wanted to be repaid. And I think TWA was going into its second bankruptcy. And they set up something called the Caribou Ticket Agreement, which actually was pretty smart by Carl. Carl got the rights to buy tickets from TWA for a 45% discount. He was not allowed to buy any tickets that started or ended in St. Louis, because that would have been embarrassing. And he was not allowed to buy tickets from, buy and sell tickets through agencies.
Okay.
He had to do it on his own. So what happened was the internet was starting to come up in those days. This was in the late 1990s. And he set up a company called lowestfare.com that sold them over the internet. And that wasn't covered. So he made a pretty good, that sort of brought back the loss he had in TWA.
Okay. Did I miss anything of what we agreed to cover? I think I
didn't even look at the sheets, so I don't see if there's anything big. I think you caught it all.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to thank you for the time that you've given to the university. And I just personally appreciate how much time you've given to us at the university.
Thank you. More than happy.
All right.